Well, I've said on this channel that there's a lot of downsides to having a president who wants to remove EV tax credits and routinely says very inaccurate things about EVs, like they can only drive for an hour and they take forever to recharge, and that fast charging stations costs billions of dollars a piece. These are all things he said even after Elon endorsed him, and Elon has never corrected him on it. There are some pros to the EV tax credit going away, and I also think that a very fair criticism of my previous statements is that, Drew, with EVs going mainstream, it's just not sustainable for the federal government to keep subsidizing every single one that is sold. Eventually, EVs are just going to become cars, right? They've got to become the norm, and in that regard, I do agree. Yeah, like, we can't have EV tax credits around forever. My justification for them, which I agree already is a weak argument, but oil is already heavily subsidized because it affects so much of our cost of living. And that means that gasoline, even for the past few decades, has been kind of artificially affordable. And I think that the advantages of EVs not taking gasoline is kind of not as obvious because oil is subsidized so much in this country. And I thought the EV tax credits kind of helped level the playing field a little bit and allowed the federal government to say, like, hey, we appreciate you for taking the plunge and spending your own money on an electric vehicle. And yes, there's some changes with that. Yes, we know that they're more expensive than typical gas vehicles, and there's a lot of things to learn with charging infrastructure and all that. So to make that decision a little bit easier for the end consumer, let's help pay for a decent chunk of that vehicle. But even that argument, I'm admitting, is falling apart a little bit because of vehicles like the Aptera. See, the federal government is kind of designed from the ground up to move somewhat slowly, and there's a lot of pros and cons to that I won't get into. But if the intent behind the EV tax credit is to reward people for driving more efficiently and driving in a more sustainable, environmentally friendly way, then it's completely backwards that the Aptera did not qualify for the federal EV tax credit simply because it didn't have a fourth wheel, even though that three-wheeled autocycle design still can go very, very far on a single charge, still has air conditioning, still has airbags and crumple zones and safety systems in place. Despite all of those advantages to the Aptera and the fact that it can actually charge itself, really no other vehicle on the market creates its own fuel over time. Basically, there's no better vehicle for the planet than an Aptera, and yet there was really no kickbacks or EV tax credits that it was qualifying for. Hopefully that changes, as California at least is looking at some credit systems that allow Aptera to generate a lot of state revenue simply by selling their all-electric auto cycle, and then gas motorcycle companies could buy credits from Aptera, very similar to what Tesla has done over the past decade. Hopefully that law gets passed in the state of California, because I think there's a lot of Aptera fans here, and that could be another tremendously good revenue stream for the company. I think it's worth mentioning that the EV tax credits going away actually benefit Aptera probably more than anybody, because essentially what it means is all of Aptera's competitors, most people, when I bring up that, Aptera is looking at a sub $40,000 price with 400-mile range and solar charging and all that, people are like, oh, well, that's cool and all, but it could be cheaper. After the tax credit, I can get a Model 3 for blah, 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 or I can get a Model Y for blah, blah, blah. But now with those tax credits going away, both for used and new EVs, it means that essentially all of the main Aptera competitors are overnight are going to go up in price by $7,500. That levels the playing field a lot more, so there's not a significant advantage to manufacturing a four-wheeled vehicle over a three-wheeled. In fact, quite the opposite now, since the federal government is not going to be involved as much with subsidizing EV sales. Now it just means that Aptera gets to pocket all of these cost savings by only having 2 seats, only having 3 wheels, not having a paint shop to worry about, only having 2 doors, and making sure that efficiency, not just in energy but also in manufacturing, is applied to every component of the vehicle. All of that helps them and is still going to be a sunk cost on other competitor vehicles, whether it's a Hyundai or a Tesla or a Ford or a GM product. They've all got more wheels. That means more axles. They've got more suspension systems. They've got more doors. They've got more seats and more complexity overall that they have to pay for. And all these different automotive companies have global supply chains. So while yes, it is true that Trump plans on instilling more tariffs on imported goods, yes, that does affect Aptera. And yes, that might mean that some of the components that Aptera sources from overseas could go up in price. It's important to acknowledge that those import tariffs affect affect everybody in the automotive space, not just Aptera. So perhaps, yes, a company like Tesla that does have a more domestic supply chain in place, they get more of their components from North America than maybe Aptera does. These are tariffs, as in fees on existing parts. So while Tesla may not have to pay an import fee on their second row of seats or the additional doors and wheels that they accommodate for on their vehicle, Aptera still has less overall parts. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the import tariffs kind of apply to everybody, and maybe in some regards they affect Aptera more than Tesla, but Tesla is still going to be missing out on a $7,500 credit, and that's on the point of purchase of the vehicle. And not only that, it should be mentioned that the EV tax credit also gives Tesla money on the battery manufacturing end, okay? So Tesla was generating revenue just from manufacturing batteries in the US. Suddenly now that's going to go away, which eats into their profit margins, which I would say stacks up quite a bit, because at least right now, all Model 3s and Model Ys in the United States are using 80 kilowatt hour battery packs. And that just made so much more sense with the EV tax credit around, because they got paid on a per kilowatt hour basis to build those battery packs. And you see how cheap Teslas are outside of the battery. You know, they remove components and screens as much as they can to simplify the manufacturing. Those battery packs were by far the most expensive component of the vehicle. So losing out on that battery pack credit, and if there's any remaining imported parts for Tesla's existing vehicles, all of those are going to be hit by the same tariffs that affect Aptera. And because Aptera is an auto cycle, and because they were outsourcing their battery pack manufacturing through partnering with a battery pack supplier from South Korea, CTNS, it means that Aptera was never really building the vehicle with the expectation that they would get the EV tax credit or that they would get kickbacks on their battery pack, because the Aptera is such a unique vehicle. It's so efficient and it's so affordable that the battery pack is actually not the most expensive component, which is quite rare in the EV space. Usually the battery pack is the most expensive cost overall, but because the Aptera only needs like a 44 kilowatt hour battery pack, it's actually the carbon fiber bank that's the most expensive component, which yes, right now they're planning on building in Italy, but I can tell you from firsthand experience they're already shipping a bunch of Bink parts to the US already. Wouldn't be surprised if Aptera's goal is to crank out as many of those components as possible before the tariffs go in place. And like any automotive company that has to go through changing administrations, Aptera will have to do the math and figure out what is worth importing versus what is worth bringing into the United States. They've said for a while now that they intend on eventually moving all of those Bink stamping components over to the US, but at least in the meantime, they said it was cheaper to just ship it from Italy. Maybe the import tariffs change that a little bit, so it might mean spending a little bit more upfront to move those stamping pieces to the US, but they'll do the math, they'll figure out if the tariffs are that bad, and ultimately, I think on the consumer end and on the battery pack manufacturing end, the Aptera has a much, much higher likelihood now of undercutting a lot of Tesla's vehicles, because import tariffs are going to affect Tesla and those tax credits are going away, which means Aptera has a much, much higher likelihood of just being, by far, no question, no one else on the market coming close, the lowest cost electric vehicle, not just to own, but also to purchase up front, that also just so happens to have 400 miles of range. You know, the Model 3 gets pretty close, but without the tax credit, that's well over $40,000 vehicle. Plus, registration and insurance tends to be more on those four-wheeled vehicles. Aptera is an auto cycle, and it's a right-to-repair company, and it doesn't have as many cameras to worry about as Tesla does. It doesn't have to build its own custom full self-driving computer, because they're just going to rely on OpenPilot, which is far more affordable, an off-the-shelf solution that people are already using today. So again, all these little things stack up, and in the long run, even though there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the Trump administration, we do know that they want to get rid of the EV tax credits, and frankly, I think that benefits Aptera in the EV space more than anybody, because they were never depending on it, and it makes all their competitors far more expensive. So what do you guys think? Is a Trump win a win for Aptera, or are there still some issues you could foresee in the future? Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.